Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvi'is, Perek Ches, Halacha Gimel, and Halacha Dalet. We're learning today Daf Samach Gimel. We left off on Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph by the Mishnah, 6 lines from the top of the Amid. And let's begin by sharing the following. First of all, we already quoted many opinions from the Rishonim that the Isser of doing Schayra, the Isser of merchandising or of doing business with product of Shvi'is, is only when you're buying and selling large amounts for profit. But most are of the opinion that it is permitted to sell small amounts in order to generate funds for your immediate food needs. We also clearly learned explicitly in the previous chapter in Perek Zayin that if a person picked produce of Shvi'is for himself or for herself, that they are allowed to sell leftovers if they have leftovers. I'm sharing these words of introduction because the whole sugya that we're going to learn in Halacha Gimel is going to be that when a person sells peiros of Shvi'is, the Chachamim forbid that person to sell it in a manner which produce is normally sold during the other 6 years. In other words, as the Mishnah will say, that when you sell it, it may not be sold loy b'midah, v'loy b'mishkal, v'loy b'minyan. It may only be sold by approximation, as we'll explain. I just want to give an intro that these halachas, we're not speaking about someone who's selling something that may not be done. We're not legislating a law for a sinner. We're saying that even when Peiros Shvi'is is being sold by Oifen Hamutar, the Chachamim on that put a limitation. And we'll see why they put that limitation. And just for the record, we have a very similar rule in Masechtas Bechorus. When a kohen receives a blemished Bechor, it becomes his private property. Not only that, once the Bechor is blemished, even though it would have been offered as a carbon, it's completely or almost completely chulin, and therefore even a Yisrael can eat it if he were to buy it. So we have similar restrictions regarding a Bechor, a kohen selling a Bechor. There also, he may not merchandise it in the meat market. He can't sell it by weight. Very similar halachas, and the Gemara is going to make various correlations between the foundational rule we're having here in Shvi'is Perek Shmini and the same similar concept by a Bechor regarding limitations of the kohen not being allowed to sell the Bechor that's blemished. Loy b'midah, v'loy b'mishkal, v'loy b'minyan. That's the sugya of Halacha Gimel. And Daf Samach Gimel Amud Beis, we're going to have the next Mishnah, Halacha Dalet. Now here, guys, we learned that when a person receives money in exchange of Shvi'is produce, so the Kedusha remains in the Shvi'is produce, but it also is imparted on that money. That money became sanctified. So the discussion will be that when a person hires a laborer, b'oifen hamuter, to pick for him some product of Shvi'is, b'oifen hamuter, there will be times where we'll say that the money he gave to the laborer is viewed as an exchange for the Peiros Shvi'is, and therefore the money will be sanctified. And there'll be other times, other words that he will use when he hires the laborer that will make us, that the halacha will say the money is being given for the work, not for the product. It's not an exchange for the product of Shvi'is. And therefore, the worker who receives this money can use the money for whatever he wants. The money is not imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is. We're going to have a very interesting expression here in the Gemara. It's called Hilchos Shel Imum Obsecure halachas, certain halachas in where the line in which the Chachamim differentiate, if you use these words, then the money is an exchange of the food. But if you use those words, then the money is an exchange of the labor. These are halachas that one can argue that it doesn't have to be that way. But the Chachamim purposefully wanted for there to be scenarios in which a laborer has money that's not imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is, because people, they need to spend money for other parts of life that one may not use Shvi'is money for. You have to pay rent, for example. I don't have to buy clothing, for example. So therefore, even though there are many rabbinic laws, and the Gemara will give examples of that, where one can argue why look at it this way, look at it the other way, dinim, the Rabbanan allows the Chachamim themselves, if the whole din is their halacha, to put certain lines which will make life easier in our case for laborers who are receiving money. And we'll leave it at that. And it's going to be fascinating. Every topic we're learning today. So we're coming back to Halacha Gimel, right? Daf Samach Gimel Lamed Aleph. And as we mentioned, there are times that a person is allowed to sell product of Shvius. Midrabanan, says the Mishnah, even when you are a selling boy from Hamuter, you may not sell it. Loy b'midam, you may not sell a product by measure, just as a measure would be, a gallon, a pint. I'm giving a liquid measure. So even items that are sold by the gallon, if it's a product of Shvius, they may not be sold by the midah, by the measure, nor b'mishkal. Mishkal means by their weight. The weight would mean, pounds, ounces, kilos, grams. Items that are sold b'mishkal, if it's a product of Shvius, it may not be sold b'mishkal. Or the other way of people selling a product in a precise manner would be b'minyan, by number, and then you may not do it. So how could you sell it? In other words, you can only sell produce of Shvius by rough estimate. Now, why is that? So we will see in the Gemara, but we're going to learn now the Marafulda. Will get a heads up. Keep your finger in the Mishnah. Look at the Marafulda by the beginning of the Mishnah. Why? When you do it that way, the buyer won't. The buyer will end up benefiting. The buyer says, "I don't know exactly how much I'm getting. If you want me to buy it, by estimation, he gives a lower number, and we'll see why we wanted for there to be a lower number." That's number one. Number two, inami, both reasons we'll see in the Gemara. By the fact that the seller has this limitation, we'll see this is more on the seller. The seller will automatically be reminded, oh, why can't I sell it normally? Because it's Peiros of Shvius. So therefore, Yinahagu behen Kedusha Shvius. He'll treat it with the Kedusha that it deserves. Now that we just finished learning in the previous year that you may not take, as an example, oil that is allowed to be used for anointing. You cannot take it to the innermost bath chamber. Why? Because people are ungarbed and it's holy, just as an example. In other words, you'll treat it with the respect that it deserves. And as a reminder, you can't sell it in any other way other than by rough estimate. Now continues the Mishnah, even when it comes to selling figs, you cannot sell them by number, nor vegetables by their weight. Now, what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? So, let's become informed of how things used to be done, maybe even today, that normally figs were sold by weight. That's the way it normally worked. Normally, vegetables were sold by number. So they used to bundle them up and they would sell them by number. So the Mishnah is trying to say that one should not think that making a shinui is enough. Okay, I can't sell it b'diuk. Okay, so figs that normally are sold by weight, the guy says, I'll sell it by number. Vegetables that are normally sold by number of bunches, of bundles, you know what? I'll sell it by weight. That's not okay.
Who's the approximation benefiting?
We'll see in a moment. The Gemara, I read them on Afulda. We'll see more detail. In other words, even that is not okay. We don't want for anything to be sold by weight, even if it's a shinui. Nothing sold by number, only by estimation. Beishamai says that that you may not sell vegetables tied in bundles. This is a big chiddush here. In other words, even when you're not counting the bundles, the number of bundles is by estimation. So you're selling by estimation. You're not counting it. You can't even bundle it. Ad kedei kach. Hold on. Beis Hillel says it depends. Beis Hillel that if you have certain products of vegetables that people will bundle them in their home, in other words, they are not only bundled because they're being sold. People bundle them, I don't know. You have to know how many vegetables you're going through in a week. You want to keep track. You want to know when you have to buy new ones. However, you want to have a seder. You don't want it to be all over the place. You don't want it to get messy. The Beis Hillel says that if vegetables are bundled for non-commercial purposes, then you are allowed to sell them bundled. Of course, you can't count the number of the bundles. The number of the bundles has to be sold by a rough estimate. But he argues with Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says you b'chlal can't bundle it. Beis Hillel says no, you only cannot bundle something that's only bundled when it's being commercialized. If something is being bundled because that's the halach yelech of how people consume it in their home, then you can bundle it. And when you sell it, everyone agrees to the principle rabbinic law that when it's sold, if it's sold, loy b'minyan, v'loy b'mishkal, v'loy b'mida, v'loy b'mishkal, v'loy b'minyan. Okay, Gavaldik. So we got the Mishnah. We got the rule. Says the Gemara, let's begin. Lama, Kevan. I know we read the Mara Fulda, but we're going to get into more details now. Like you said, who's benefiting or what's the purpose? The purpose will all be for us to remember that it's Peiros Shvius, that has Kedusha Shvius, that has restrictions of Shvius. Lama, Kadeshi Im Kurubazo. So first of all, psychology. No one pays full price when they buy by estimate. I know people that never pay full price b'chlal. Kevin is laughing. Certain culture, they have to negotiate you down. But avada, if they don't even know how much they're getting, they're gonna pay a lesser price. In other words, they're gonna pay a bargain rate. Now, let's hold on a second. Why do you pay a bargain rate? Chevra, hefked. Let's begin. Peiros Shvius begins as hefked. Doesn't belong to anyone. It only makes sense. In other words, we want for people to remember it's Peiros Shvius. How do you remember that if you pay a bargain rate? Because why would you pay a bargain rate? Why would the seller allow to undersell only if, because it really is hefker? Since it originates as hefker, it makes sense. Gewaldig. Another thing, when do people make profit? People make profit when something is commercialized, business. Since you have this isur midai raisa la'achla v'loy l'schayra, so it's a reminder that you cannot commercialize it, even though you are commercializing it ba'ofen hamuter. It has like these dual sides to it. So the Gemara wants to understand something. If the point is to pay, the goal is to remember that it's Peiros Shvius, and when you pay a bargain rate, you're going to remember, why did I pay? Why did I get away with paying so little? Because it was hefker, because it's Peiros Shvius. So why do you have to put the line? Why do you have to put the restriction of not even selling it by exact? It has to be rough estimate. Why? Let the guy count it out. Let the guy weigh it out. And then you have to give a 10% off. In other words, the Chachamim should make the Gezeda to achieve their goal, sell it cheap. Let the person use weights. The typical weight then was a liter weight. And go straight. Why do you have to do A, which causes B, which causes C, and the goal is C? Go straight to C. So the Gemara says, because im amar at kain, if you were to allow someone to weigh it and then sell it for a discount, cheap discount, af who ain't anoyig b'hem kedusha. The goal isn't only for the buyer to remember that his produce is shvius produce. He'll remember that because he paid a discounted price. People always remember that. I got this for very cheap. The seller also has to be reminded. In other words, for the seller to treat, or for the seller to have a respectful attitude when it comes towards the produce, going back to what we mentioned, he can't take it into a latrine, can't take it into a bathhouse. There's kedusha there. When the seller has to, before selling it, he already remembers, he can't bundle it like Beis Shammai ever. He can't do this, he can't do that. That's going to be reminders that there's kedusha in there. In other words, we want both the seller and the buyer to remember that it's Peiros Shvius. Buyer, go ahead.
Well, just put a label on it, like they do now.
You know how expensive labels used to be? Think about it. What would they use for a label?
Red flag.
A grass, and tie it on every celery.
I think Kevon's point is that, think about truma.
Yeah.
Right. You were able to sell truma, but it was a cheaper price. There was only a lot of we sold to Kayanim.
I think truma, because of the fear that you chayv misa b'dei shamayim to eat it, people remembered it's truma. People really remember truma. They separated truma. They put it in a thing, and they made a mark, mem or tav.
Right.
We learned that in the Mishnah. And shvius is not so. It's not as holy as. It's interesting.
Thank you.
This is a rabbinic injunction.
Yes. Very important. That we'll see in a moment. Okay. Oh, says the Gemara, and now let's start learning a couple of braysos. Tani, we learned in a brayso. Peiros chutz la'aretz shenichnasu la'aretz. We're speaking about on the Shvius here. We want to remind ourselves that it wasn't the times of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. We learned that before. There was a time when you were not allowed to import at all Peiros chutz la'aretz because of the Gush Eretz Ha'amim, not to proliferate Tuma in Eretz Yisrael. Remember that. But at some point, there was no produce in Israel. Gush Eretz Ha'amim is midrabanan. The Chachamim have a power to say, we made the Gzeira, we're going to take away the Gzeira. So at some point, they began to import products on the Shvius year, michutz la'aretz. So listen to what the Baraisa says. This product is not paid a Shvius. Nevertheless, even that, lo yiu nimkaren lo b'mida v'lo b'mishka v'lo b'minyan ela kepeid ha'aretz. Hawawawi. Why says that Asher Ilyo Veistachem middle at left column around 10 lines from the bottom? The Gazer who Atu Hani that it's Yisrael. They wanted for people to remain so cognitive, so aware of the fact that Peter Shvius may not be sold. I got it wrong. Mida Mishkal Minyan. That they made as Aloy Plug. And nothing. Shvius, you're selling product, you got to sell it by estimate. However, that's only for people not to make a mistake. But if the imported product is known to be imported, I just gave an example. You imported something that does not grow in Eretz Yisrael. You can't confuse it. This doesn't grow here. It only grows over there in New Zealand. So then, mutar, gewaldig. Okay, weiter. Says the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbun. Now, Kur dekaya, there's a machlekes amongst the Noisa Kalim. Either it refers to the Kurds, Kur dekaya, it's referring to a group of people, or the Pnei Moshe says that Kur dekaya is a Kurdish wheat, whichever way imported. Okay? Elaine Kur dekaya, the Solkin umizdabnin min susisa litiveria. They bring a product from Susisa, which is chutz la'aretz, and they sell it in the markets of Tiveria. Just as an example, the product is recognizably not from Eretz Yisrael. This type of wheat does not grow in Israel, or the people that are selling it, they look like Kurds. You know, they're foreigners. They're not from here. It's evident that it's not from Eretz Yisrael. That's Rabbi Yosef Rabbun. So here they can sell it the way they want. They could sell it b'mida or b'mishkol or b'minyan. Rab Chizkiya b'shem Rab Abba Bar Mamol. Zeh shehu moeded b'kefisha. When a seller who usually sells a measured produce, and how does he measure it? He measures it by putting it in a basket. What does that mean? So look inside that Asher Ilyo left 4 lines for the bottom. That Perush Rashi, that this was brought down in Masechtas Gittin and the Bavli, and Rashi over there says, Keli, a utensil. Sha'oisin min beloy chamasois ve'ein mekablan tumah. So a person would have pieces of leather then that were no longer usable for a flask, and they nothing was wasted then. And they took all of these little pieces of leather and they made it into a basket. The point is that this is not a measure basket. It's not a basket that was made to put something in there to know how much is in there. Nevertheless, if a person already sold a product using his handmade shmata basket, but he did it 2 or 3 times. What happens when you do something 2 or 3 times? The owner who used his handmade shmata basket to measure out a product when he's selling it, at some point becomes very knowledgeable with his basket. You know, Yada Inish Benaftre, with his Nechasim, this basket means it has 2 liters. I know, when it comes to that patch, it's 1 liter. When it comes to the other patch, it's another liter. Once the seller knows that, even though it's not a basket that an ordinary person would know how much is in there, it looks like it's an estimate. But if the owner knows b'diyuk, became familiarized with his keli, then also lamid ba'am gavaldik, because he knows how much is in it. And another nuance. Okay, you can argue the whole thing is for the buyer. It doesn't matter if the buyer doesn't know. The seller knows. I would even go further. The bigger chiddush is that when the seller knows how much is in there, it could even be that the buyer will think he's getting a discount. Maybe he's not getting a discount. Maybe it looks, the buyer thinks, since it's a rough estimate, he's not telling him, the seller knows info he's not sharing. The buyer is saying, I don't know how much is the measure. I'm going to pay, he lowballs the price. The seller agrees because the seller knows that the buyer is getting much less. Doesn't matter. As long as the buyer thinks he got a discounted price, that's the Zajac. Why did the seller not push back? Because it's paid as shvius, because it began as hefker. So anyways, it began as being ownerless. It works. The purpose works, and therefore it's asur. No. And therefore, no. So you would think it's mutter. Mitzad the buyer, it would be mutter, but mitzad the seller, it's asur. That was the beginning of today's Gemara. Why you would just make sell it bezoil? It's even though the buyer is getting it by rough estimate, he doesn't know how to look at that keli. The seller knows how much is in the keli. It's usher. Both have to have this vagueness as a reminder. Amar Rabbi Shaya, the Chavedaf Samach Gimel Amid Beis. Rabbi Shaya therefore said that it's prohibited. Asir meimar. It's prohibited for the buyer to tell the seller, avad etzba'ach, use your finger. Now, use your finger, look inside. There's two ways of understanding the statement. Either the marafulda, a top line, asur meimar, asur loimer, avad etzba'ach, which means when you sell something by estimate, what happens if they don't verbalize the number, whatever the number is? But the buyer tells the seller, I know it's shvius. You can't tell me how many pounds. Show me with your fingers how much. That you can't do that. It's not about you can't verbalize the number. You can't know the number. Like we said, we don't want for the seller nor for the buyer to know. That's one way of understanding it. The Pnei Moshe has a whole different way. Or the same thing that Asherilio. The Pnei Moshe that Asherilio says that you can't use your finger for the measure. Some people would stick their finger into a liquid and they would know in this type of keli that if the water comes up to this knuckle, it means this many ounces. If it comes over to the other knuckle, there are more ounces. Same concept. Even though it's not your usual way of measuring, if the seller knows how much is being sold because he has his own privatized siman, like by the basket, that's the way they learn it. It's also forbidden. Okay, and now we're going to compare.
This whole eyeballing method or estimation method meant to specifically benefit the buyer, so to speak. I can picture like a situation where the seller knows what he's doing, especially certain cultures, right? So it's an estimation. Don't worry, I'm giving you a good deal. Meanwhile, you're really not. Like, is that part of it? Or
the goal is that when a buyer will at least think that he got something for cheap, he's gonna remember why did I get such a deal? Because it's a paid shvius. The buyer says it's just for it to be cheap. The seller didn't own it. When I sell you my merchandise, when you sell someone your service, of course the guy pays. He says the guy is giving me a service. If everything is hefker, and like we mentioned, selling paid shvius to begin with is already limited. It reminds them that it was paid shvius because it was cheap. Okay. Now, this is very important, Chavra. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai have an argument in the Mishnah, and the argument revolves around whether you can ever sell vegetables in bundles. Of course, you may never count the number of bundles, so there's an estimation here. There's a rough estimate. Beis Shammai says you can't even bundle. Beis Hillel says, hold on. Beis Hillel says that if a person, the norm is that you bundle these types of vegetables for your home use, for non-commercial purposes. Let's just say for storage. Certain vegetables, when you store them in your home, you don't want them to be all over the place. You bundle them. The bundling doesn't mean you're commercializing it. Sell the bundles by rough estimate. Beis Shammai went even more. The Gemara's question will be against the opinion of Beis Hillel. And now let's jump quickly, like we mentioned, that a b'char of a kosher domesticated animal, if the first emission of the womb of the mother was a male, that animal is automatically kadosh mirachem. It actually has to go on the mizbeach, but you have to give it to a kohen to bring it on the mizbeach. And here you have this unique halacha that if the b'char gets halachically blemished, number one, it won't go on the altar. You're not allowed to. But number two, normally when an animal was supposed to go on the mizbeach, once it's no longer, it's called psuli hamikdashim, there's so much residue of kedusha, there's many restrictions on it. Not by a b'char. If the b'char gets blemished, it becomes bona fide property of the kohen. Not only that, even a Yisrael can eat it. Now there are still asur begizer, asur b'avodah, there are certain limitations, because after all, it was going to go on the altar, but it becomes property of the kohen. Now, the kohen can sell it. There we also find the rabbinic law that if the kohen is going to sell it, he may not merchandise it the way you normally merchandise meat. And that includes two halachas. Number one is he may not sell it loy b'minyan, same words there, loy b'mida, v'loy b'minyan, v'loy b'mishkal. But we're going to go into another detail regarding him cutting up the meat. Whether he can cut up the meat, whether he cannot cut up the meat, like bundles, then whether you can sell the bundles by number, for sure not. So let's read inside and we'll see how it appears that they are similar, and yet it appears that Beis Hillel's approach won't be accepted in B'chayres. So says the Gemara, Tabach Kohen, a butcher was a Kohen, and we'll see why we're emphasizing another interesting system. The butchers then own the meat. The tabach, today the butcher doesn't own them. Today the butcher already buys packaged meats. All these butchers over here on Pico. The butcher then would buy the animal, he would shech the animal, he would package the animal or cut them up in his home. That's the way it worked. And then he would take it to a shop and he would sell it. I'm saying this is important. Tabach koyin shenismano loy b'chor. So the question is, we normally say that if it's b'chor, you may not sell it in the normal manner, which includes two dinim. Din number one is that in the market, you can't sell it b'mishkal. I think meat was normally sold by weight. Can't do that way. Or b'mishkal. Number two is that even that which he is selling, by estimate, you can't cut it up the way you normally cut up meat. Everything has to be by rough estimation. But this guy is a tabach. He's not stamach coin. He's doing that anyways. His whole business is that when he gets meat, he cuts them up in his home. So even though he's not going to sell the b'char meat, b'mishkal, he won't do that. Could he at least cut it in his house? That's the question. It's not something that is unusual for him.
Wasn't
He does it for his business.
Common practice? Wasn't it a common practice for people to mitagid, to gather together and purchase the behema together, and then the chalukah would have
100%. So Yakir is reminding us there was no refrigeration. That a tabach, why would he shech the big animal if he only has two clients? Unless it was an erev yontiv, normally he would wait. But it's not related to what we're talking about. What we are talking about is that not only do we have this concept of not selling it by weight, you can't cut it up in the usual way. Like by the vegetables, there's bundling the vegetables, and then they're selling them by numbers of bundles. Beis Hillel says that you are allowed to bundle it. The only thing is you can't sell it by numbers. Beis Hillel allows that if you anyways bundle it for non-commercial purposes. I know that this will be the difference between here and there. Here we're speaking about a tabach. The tabach, when you have the number yakir of customers, what does he do? He takes the animal. He doesn't shecht it in a shop. He shechs it, who knows where they would shecht it. He would take it to his home. You have to salt it. There's a whole avodah. He would do it in his house, the tabach. He would cut it up in specific ways. So if I agreed to buy the flanken meat, I knew exactly how he cut it in his house. And then he would sell it. So the question is, if this guy is anyways doing such cutting of animals for his own business, a non-bechar animal meat, if he happens to be a kohen, he happened to receive a bechar, the bechar happens to be blemished, so he's allowed to sell it. So maybe now, Mao Mikate Kuptin, is he allowed to cut it into slices the way you normally slice up meat? Umezabne Gavashuka, and to sell it in the marketplace. Are you allowed to do it or not? Or not? Right? Look inside the Rashirilio, around 10 lines from the top in the right column. Mao Mekato Kuptin, Lechoitchoi Chatichos, Babais, to cut it into the way meat is normally cut up. Ulohoitzi Lushuk Limkon. The mai diktani memasnisen. Hainu lekroy welcome shuk lemarchroi. Even though you're not allowed to merchandise it in the normal way in the meat market, here, this guy anyways, in other words, he's not selling bechar meat. He anyways is selling meat. So could he now go ahead at least and cut it up? So Rabbi Yirmiyah savar meimar shrim and hada. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I'll prove you from our Mishnah that you are allowed to do it. From who? From Beis Hillel. In other words, even though when the kohen will be selling the bechar meat, he'll have to make a shinoi in the marketplace, but at least in the home, he can cut it regular. Cutting it and bundling vegetables are very similar. As he's quoting our Mishnah here in Shavuos, that Beis Hillel says that if you anyways are bundling it in your house, you can sell it to sell. You can bundle it to sell it. There's one thing. Beis Hillel also holds when you sell the bundled vegetables, you can't count them. That's okay, but you're allowed to bundle them. So l'chura, the same thing will be over here. So the Gemara says, no, Amalei Rav Mana, how can you compare one case to the other? Kol garma hida amraduhu asur. No, the whole rule over there in Bechayres is that a kohen who is selling his bechar, not only, there's two dinim there, not only may he not sell it by weight, but even the way he packages it, which means the way he cuts it, may not be done in the usual way. Can't do that. Should be clear that this is holy meat. However, our Mishnah is different. Why is our Mishnah different? Because when Beis Hillel says you can bundle the vegetables of Shvius, that's only, like the Beis Hillel says the words, Es shedar koile oged bebayis. That's if you bundle the vegetables in your house for non-commercial purposes. Here, you want to know whether you can cut the meat ba'oifen that it's being cut for commercial purposes. That is something that you may never do, even though you're doing it in your house. Even though when you sell it in the marketplace, you'll make another shinoi. You won't weigh it. But if the way it's being cut in your house is to merchandise it, then you're not allowed to do it ever.
Rabbi, the bechor meat that's sanctified, the only reason you have to make a shinui is that you don't feed it to animals?
I think there are other restrictions.
Like
once the animal is
can't sell it to goy, you can't.
I don't remember that. If there's left, there are other restrictions on the meat itself.
Okay.
What I'm thinking about is whether you're allowed to take the meat out of Eretz Yisrael. Are there any restrictions with Psul Yoitz? I don't remember. Don't forget, it's a big chiddush by Bechayr. It was holy. It was Kedushas Mizbeach. You don't find this in any other place. You don't find any other carbon. That's dafka because it was Kadosh Menachem, a carbon that we designated as a carbon. It was, if there was a moment when it was roy to go up on the Mizbeach, if now it becomes puzzle, Psul HaMikdashim. It doesn't go out l'chulin. Or maybe it does. It's also because of avodah. And if it's always the same thing. And then when you sell it, you have these restrictions.
That's a vestige of.
That's right. Okay. Now, Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah Dalet, Halacha Dalet, really in the introduction, we spoke about one rule. There's two rules in the Mishnah. We'll see it straight inside. This is really fascinating. The Mishnah is based on the rule that if you sell Peder Shvis, if money is given for Peder Shvis, then when it comes to the Kedusha remains in the original, and the Kedusha is also now the Meyem Shvis. Here we're speaking about someone who is getting paid to pick Ba'oifan HaMuter product of Shvis for someone else. So Reuven wants to eat certain vegetables. Reuven doesn't want to go pick them. Reuven tells Shimon, do me a favor, pick those for me. Reminding everyone that I know that there is an Isur Sfichim that is Asur Midrabanan. But we also learned that certain types of aftergrowths that normally are not planted to grow in the wild are not included in Isur Sfichim. That's what we're talking about. Notice we're not speaking about anyone doing anything forbidden. We are talking about someone, Shimon, who's getting paid to pick the product of Shvius. Now, there's two ways of looking at that wage. One way is the money that he's getting paid is for his labor. If Shimon got paid for his labor, then there is no kedusha in the money that he's receiving. Correct? If Shimon, everything is really hefker. If we were to view that the money that Reuven paid Shimon is not for Shimon's labor, but it's for the payda, it's for the product, it's for those svichim that are mutter, then the money is in exchange of the svichim. Then the mayhem will be shvius. Beautiful. So that's the thing. So it says the Mishnah. So you have to know, how did he hire the worker? What words did he use? Hoi melapayel. When you tell your worker during the shvius year, hey loch isor zeh. Guys, just to know for the record, the isor is 8 prutalach. It's a small amount of money. Vilaket li yarak hayoim, and pick for me vegetables today. Take this isser and pick for me vegetables. So then schare mutar. So then we say that the money does not have any shvi'is kedusha. Why not? Because that type of words that are used while he hired him imply the money is for the labor. Why is the money for the labor? I'll tell you why. Because he did not even say then to the worker, pick for me vegetables for the worth of an isur. Didn't say that. He told him, pick for me vegetables today. He didn't insist that he wants to get the worth of an isur. Take this coin and pick for me vegetables. So why is he paying him an isur? Because he's picking the vegetables. It's for the labor, not for the vegetable. But if he says, laket bi boy yarakayoim, pick for me, boy, that's the key word, pick for me for this vegetables today, that leans mashma that he wants to get an isur worth of vegetables. So then we view the money that the Shimon will get as really money for an exchange of the vegetables, which is shvius. And therefore, schara yasur. Pick vegetables for this isur means pick an isur worth. That's the key. Okay. Beautiful. Now, there's another din in this Mishnah that we did not speak out on the intro. B'chlal, there's a rule. That you're not allowed to pay for a purchase with shvius produce. You can't do that. You can't pay down a debt with shvius produce. Another restriction on shvius produce. That's the general rule. Now we're going to see the following. Look inside this case. Just to know, we said that isser. A pudyon is 2 issers, and a pudyon was the normal price that a person would pay for a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread was a standard 2 meal, which is how much people ate during the day. Pras, people ate a half of their loaf for breakfast, a half of the loaf for dinner. I'm just saying that was the normal thing. Okay? So again, a pudyon was the price for a loaf of bread. So a guy takes from a baker a loaf of bread, which is worth this normal price, and he says to him, he doesn't pay. So he has a debt. That when I'll pick vegetables from the field, again, not svichim, vegetables that you could pick, then avi lecha, I'll bring it to you. So you would think, how can you do that? He's taking a loaf of bread, so he owes money.
Barter.
It's a barter. And he can't pay them with the paydays of shvius. We don't say that. We say it's mutter. Why do we say it's mutter? Because we understand that they're saying, you do me a favor, I'll do you a favor. You give me a gift, I'll give you a gift. That's what the Rashi Elio says. Look inside the second line from the top and the left. Kikar bepudyon, shedimkar bepudyon, a normal loaf of bread. V'akikar eino mi pei shvius. The bread is not paid shvius. And v'loy katzatz imay damim. And there wasn't. This is important. So,
But he clearly gives in condition to receive something.
yes, he did. Yes, he did.
You just changed the word of transaction to gift.
No, okay, let's read it. It wasn't the way you normally take from the market. When you take from the market and the guy says you owe me the money, they go to the cash register. They go, and they say, you bought today over here $40.50, and I'm putting it in the book. That then when you pay the money, you're paying a debt. Here you took a loaf of bread. That I know that I owe you a pidyon, that's because that's the standard. That's the emphasis over here. They never spoke numbers. I took a loaf of bread. Favor for favor. Everything is hefker. They allow that. But that's only because when he took the bread, he told them, listen, taking a bread, when I'm going to go next time to the fields, I'm going to do some for you. They allowed it. But if he takes the bread and says nothing, even though they never spoke a number on the loaf of bread, but the loaf of bread is a pudyon, it's known. Without saying that I will, whenever I'm going next time out there to the fields, I'm going to do you a favor. If he didn't say that, then I'm not allowed to pay him with something that I picked. Lo yishalem idmei shvius. Why? Because of the rule, she'ein poidem chayv idmei shvius. In other words, when I go into, it's very simple. When I go into a store and I say nothing, saying nothing means I'm buying on credit. When I'm going into a store and I'm telling the person, we're speaking on the shvius here, listen, chevre, I'm going tomorrow there, I'm going to do you a favor tomorrow. If I say that I'm doing you a favor, we understand that what I'm taking now is also as a favor, as a gift. Guys, we're going to learn about this more in the Gemara. Let's learn today's daf. Today's daf will be focusing on the Reisha, the same thing on the Reisha. Like, what difference does it make how you word it to the worker? Why are we saying that this means you're paying for the labor? And that means you're making an exchange. The Gemara fragt on the Reisha, Mali ho'omer laket li, ubeino omer laket li boy. What difference does it make? It's obvious. I want to explain to you the kasha. Isser is a very small amount of money. Isser is like a nickel. Okay, a nickel is 5 pennies. Isser was 8 prut. It's a very small amount of money. No one works for an Isser for the whole day. It doesn't exist. So when I tell a worker, if I tell my friend, Reuven tell Shimon, take this Isser and gather for me vegetables today. Don't think that Shimon feels mechuyev to pick vegetables the whole day. It's never going to happen that way. Shimon understands that he's going to pick vegetables approximately in the worth of an Isser, and Reuven will be happy. That's why the Gemara is asking a question. In other words, even though he worded, the exact words is, the words of the Mishnah is that Heilocha Isser zeh ulekoit li yerek hayoim. So what? The Shimon is not going to work the whole day. He's not paying him a day's job. No one works a whole day for one Isser. He's only going to pick the value of an Isser. So it should always be viewed as an exchange of the vegetable, not wage for labor. That's the Gemara's kasha. And the Gemara acknowledges that you're right. Rabbi Oven b'shem Rabbi Yosi ben Chanina, look at this expression. You should know you're right, that mahalocha shel imum hi. These are included in those halachas that are called obscure halachas. Obscure. And that means like this, the Chachamim deemed it necessary to have a lenient attitude when it comes to paying a worker, because workers need money. They need money for night, like you have to pay rent. So they found a way to be mated it. And let's read one more. We're going to go to the bottom of the Amid. Tanin and Taman, very similar. We find in Meiser Sheni. By the way, we're almost there. We're learning Shvius, next Masechtas Trumais, then comes Meisers, then comes Meiser Sheni. That lo yomer adam lachaveiroi ha'alas ha'peres va'ela liYerushalmi leicholek. Right, you have to take Peres Meiser Sheni to eat in Yerushalayim. Okay? What happens if I want to take my produce? I don't want to exchange it on money. I have to add a chaimish. I don't want to add a chaimish. But you have to. I don't have koyach, so I'm paying. I'm hiring a porter. Can I pay the porter with the product of Meiser Sheni in exchange? So the Mishnah says no. If I use the words leicholek, I'm going to divide it with you, because that's called you're using Peres Meiser Sheni to pay for a service. Can't do that. Peres Meiser Sheni is to eat, to drink, and sicha b'chlal shesiya. How could you do it? They found a way. Elo oimeloi halein. He doesn't say the word lecholik. That's all he doesn't have lechalik. Bring them up. Shenoich leminishtem Yerushalayim. That's it. Since he doesn't say the words leicholek, he didn't say the word dividing, so we don't use it as a business arrangement. We view it chevra as a gift, Keva, a gift. You're doing me a favor, and I'm going to do you a favor. Come on, what difference does it make just because he didn't use the word? Here also we say, everything is based that since midoiraisa, even if you were to say leicholek, that's not bona fide schoida. The isur of doing schoida with Pedis Maisa Sheni is not lecholik. Anything that's only asur midrabanan, that's why we began today's share, it's only isur midrabanan, the Chachamim have the right to say that will be lenient to make things work better. And the same thing will be over here and to be continued.